Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now, today I'm honoured to be speaking with ballet dancer Kit Holder. Kit, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hi Dan.
Great to have you on. Why don't we start by you introducing yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Well, my name's Kit. I am a professional ballet dancer. I've been a dancer with Birmingham Royal Ballet for 20 years now. I just completed, or rather didn't complete, my 20th season because of the lockdown. We didn't perform. I trained at the Royal Ballet School in London from the age of 11. That was a boarding school for 5 years. And then I did 2 years also at the senior level. Before I was lucky enough to work actually as a student, as a kind of extra on a UK tour with Birmingham Royal Ballet. And to keep a long story short, I asked them for a job at the end of that tour, and they said no, that I wasn't what they were looking for. And then our company went away on their summer break. I prepared to go back to the Royal Ballet School for another year. And in the end, one of the dancers left the company at fairly short notice, and they needed a quick replacement. So they called me, asked me if I still wanted the job. I said, yes, of course. I started, I think, 2 days later. And I think about 2 weeks after that, we were in New York on tour, which was the most exciting start to a career. And that was 20 years ago. And I've been performing with the company ever since, all the usual sort of hurdles in a career, injuries and surgeries. I've done some choreography as well, and I'm still dancing, still hopefully going strong in my prime years when most people would have probably retired. And I'm now studying as well.
I'm going to be a complete psychologist and dive straight into, it sounded like you had some rejection straight away. How did you deal with that?
It was an interesting one, and in my personal history, I grew up a little bit outside of Birmingham, and this company at that point wasn't actually Birmingham Royal Ballet. They were based in London. They were called Sadler's Wells Royal Ballet, and they were touring the UK, and it was that company that came to Birmingham on a fairly regular basis, and my parents would take me to see that company. And actually I also danced with them as a child, so for 3 successive Christmases between the age of 8 and 10, I did the Nutcracker performances, and I fell in love with it at that age. And I also, which is quite rare for a child, I went on tour with the company on a UK tour as well in a different show, and I absolutely loved everything about it. This seemed to me to be a group of people who were a bit like a gang. They were out on tour like a travelling circus, kind of. Everyone seemed to be having such a great time. And the atmosphere was great, and I thought already at sort of 10 years old, great, that's what I'm going to do with my life. So when I went off to train for my vocational training at 11, that was always my target, was to come back to the company. So the first thing when I was 17 and I was working with the company, the first kind of relief, if you like, was I still felt that way about it. I still loved it. I still wanted to do it. I still thought the atmosphere in the company was great. And you're looking at it as a kind of almost a real adult lens at that point, and you're seeing the potential downsides and the frustrations of that kind of lifestyle. But I still wanted it. So it was a bit of a kick in the teeth to be told, yeah, actually, and it wasn't, we don't have anything. It was, no, you're not what we're looking for, which is different. But, there's a lot of great dance companies around, and I was also quite fortunate that I had 2 older brothers who at that point were both actually still professional dancers. So I got this kind of sense of the wider world within dance as well, and the other kinds of dance companies I could be in. So it wasn't a closed door to the profession at that point, but it was a probable closed door to this company.
And as you say, it was something that you targeted for a long time. So there must have been an element of strong disappointment there.
Absolutely, yeah. But I have very wise parents who have always kind of cautioned against throwing all your eggs in one basket. Even at 10 years old, they were saying, "Are you sure you want to go and be a ballet dancer?" And in my infinite wisdom as a 10-year-old, I was absolutely sure. But they of course ensured that I did the entrance exams for academic schools locally and so on. And all the way through my dance training, they were really, really pushing my academic side. because there's as in all kind of elite disciplines, there's a big drop-off rate. Not everybody can get to that aspect of the career, the performing or playing career. So yeah, I think I was always ready. Disappointment's part of life, and it's anyone that's got these kind of elite performance aspirations, disappointment and those frustrations, they are part of it, and it's almost the sooner you can have them in life, the better.
Obviously, being the Sports Psych show, we're going to be talking about the psychological side of dancing here, and striving to relate it to sport, because I know you have two other passions other than dancing, and that is sport and psychology. And you're currently doing a degree in psychology, which I really want to, that's the main reason, amongst many reasons, why you've come on today. We're going to really emphasise that and talk about it. But I would like to just ask you to travel back in time. You've spoken a little bit there about falling in love with dancing. Did dancing, when you reflect back, was it skills that just came easily to you? Did you find yourself better than others, that you learnt quicker than others?
I think as a boy on the outskirts of Birmingham, it was a very narrow field. Really,
I can imagine that. Yeah.
It was it wasn't so much that I was better than other people. It was more often than not I was the only one. There's another lad who went through almost an identical parallel process. We were in the same dance school, and he's a professional dancer now. We're still good friends, and he's having a great career as well. But there aren't too many others from this area and that period. So yeah, it's a narrow field. In terms of why dance, I suppose really is the question there, and I don't know is the answer. I love music. And I know that dance was my response to music. So that's the kind of innate thing, if you like, that was always there. And I also think there's an element of that kind of learned behaviour, learned response from my brothers. That was the kind of model that I grew up with. Why classical ballet? I think that's almost entirely because that's what my brothers had studied, and I think also in terms of pathways, educational pathways, it's slightly different now, but if you're going to be able to go off to a vocational training, that's likely to focus quite heavily on classical ballet, and many people do then move from classical ballet into more contemporary styles, and I think my particular career goals weren't that. I think if I'd worked with a company and fallen in love with a company and dance style at a young age, that may well have been the case, but given that this was the company that I aspired to. And we do a range of work in this company. It's not all tutus and fairy stories, but there's still time maybe for a different dance style. Who knows? See me on Strictly one day.
Why not? Create one yourself. Create a unique dance style. And I suppose on the basis of creation, something I'm interested in terms of performing arts, is the acquisition of skill, which I would always argue sports psychology is heavily involved in skill acquisition. When you reflect back to being a kid, and even now, you'll be learning new moves and or honing and developing. How does that work in dance? Is it strictly about repetition? How do you acquire skill? How do you develop your technique?
So, one of the things that I've reflected on a lot, actually, from listening to your podcast, you're listening to skill act coaches, and going, what's the equivalent of that in our world? Within classical ballet, the bulk of the movement vocabulary is based around a relatively small set of exercises that we do every single day in our daily class. So, these are really codified movements, and the basic structure of a ballet class hasn't changed in hundreds of years. So the individual exercises, the way the exercises are put together, obviously will change from day to day, but the order and the sequence of that class and the movements it contains are essentially the same all around the world. And then anything that is really going to be described as classical ballet will be based around that series of movements. Obviously, over time, that's evolved. It's been challenged. It's been deconstructed. So a lot of the kind of grounding and the basis for ballet is there, and it's refined and improved every single day. That's the aim. At the kind of upper level of that as a set of skills, where you're getting into virtuoso work, that is an interesting one, because I'm just thinking, where do we learn that? And when I was learning, we weren't looking at YouTube or Instagram and seeing all these amazing things. So we'd have a kind of scratchy VHS tape of a Russian dancer from the 70s, or and we'd be watching a move over, and you could tell from the videotapes which moves were most impressive, because they'd be the one that were the most grainy from being played over and over again. But a lot of that was trial and error. I'm thinking about the kind of coaching side and the teaching side. So in our company, we have several members of what we call ballet staff, and they will lead rehearsals, they'll teach the class, and they would be the people that are responsible for coaching those particular movements. But of course, we're I think 54 dancers in the company, and we're quite a tight-knit bunch, so we'll help each other out quite a lot as well, and there's a lot of practicing that goes on. So our morning class would be the equivalent of a kind of daily training that you would have, say, in a football team, a football club. And you hear all those stories, such and such a player is the player that stayed behind, and he or she is then, the expert in free kicks or set pieces generally. And we have the same thing, the people that stay behind after training, and they're practicing pirouettes or a particular trick, a particular jump or whatever. So a lot of it is just kind of sheer determination just to nail this step, and a lot of falling over in the process. These days we do a lot of video work for ourselves. The honest truth, though, is that for most of the performers in the company, we rarely do something that has that level of real technical challenge. It really is the top level. So the structure of most ballet companies, you have what they call the corps de ballet at the bottom, which is probably 20, 25 people, who are the people that do all the group work generally, and then that goes through several sort of layers until you have the principal dancers at the top. And for example, those people would rarely perform as part of the group, and they're the people that are doing the really virtuoso technical things. So they're the real maestros on the stage. At the moment these days, I sit somewhere in the middle of all of that. So I do featured work, featured roles. Yep. I do get the spotlight sometimes, but I also still work as part of the group sometimes. Sometimes I'm the old guy. I play a grandfather in some of the shows, for example. I'm 37.
But, wow. I'd be the great grandfather then.
But I'm dancing alongside 19-year-olds as well a lot of the time. So my position now is interesting, and actually the skill act thing is really interesting, and it's one of the reasons that I was motivated to really get in and study psychology. So I don't know if you want to ask the question or whether I'll just get into that, because I'm kind of seeking into it myself. So I'll just go ahead on that, because there's talking of virtuoso steps, there's a particular solo that I've danced for many years in a show that keeps coming back. It's actually our production of Romeo and Juliet. Okay. And it's at the more virtuoso end of things that I would usually do. So it's something that I wouldn't necessarily have given that role to me. If it were up to me, I would give it to people who are sort of more virtuoso, I would say more capable. I'm not sure that's necessarily the right way of putting it. And I noticed this really interesting, that I knew from the beginning, because I'm a pragmatist and a realist, that I was never going to execute this particular sequence of movements in the way that I was seeing some of the other brilliant dancers around me, in the way that they were able to do it. But I thought, you know what, they've cast me in this. It's a real opportunity, and I'm gonna really attack it. And the first time I did it, I never really nailed it the way I wanted to. it was never a secure skill. So I did a lot of video work, really breaking down the movement, and I had a lot of help from our rehearsal staff, from my colleagues and so on. Never really got on top of it. And it was sort of passable, I would say. And then the next time that show came around, they put me in the role again, and I thought, right, this is the time. I'm going to absolutely smash this step this time. And a really interesting thing happened, which was that I went in a really constructive approach with all purposeful practice and all these things that I'd learned. I'd probably been a professional dancer about 10 years at that point. So I had some experience to really guide my approach to that. And a week, almost exactly before we opened the show, I completely lost the ability to do the step. Now, these days, I would look at that as something like skill loss syndrome. I mean, it was completely foreign to my body, and I just could not do it. So I struggled through those shows. Some were better, some were worse. And then a few years later, we did that show again. And I had that experience to draw on and went, right, this is the time I'm going to nail the step. And exactly the same thing happened. And then we did the show again, and the same thing happened. And I'm going, this has to be psychological. It has to be. There is no other explanation, but I couldn't explain it psychologically. And just to round that particular story off, there was one show, it was opening night. At this point, I'd progressed through the ranks enough that they were putting me in the opening show, because normally in shows we'll have a kind of rotation of several different casts of dancer. And it was the opening night, and it's the best I've ever danced that solo. And I was overjoyed, I was so happy, and I thought, hallelujah, I've finally cracked it. I've broken this sort of mental curse, if you like. And then I was also dancing it the following afternoon, and it's absolutely the worst show I've ever done, and we haven't danced it again, and I don't know if I ever will dance that again. So unfortunately, I left that one on a kind of disappointment, if you like, personally.
As I always say after listening to somebody regale something really interesting, I think there's so many avenues I can go down here. Let me start, I suppose, with the bigger picture. You've made a statement. I'm convinced it was psychological. What convinces you it was psychological? What convinces you it was psychological, and what do you think it was from a psychological perspective?
I have, and this is interesting because I mentioned before that there's not a huge in dance we don't have psychology and to the same extent that is in sport, but this is actually one of the few things I have had a consultation with a sports psychologist about, and she's Britt Taggett-Foxall. She's a brilliant psychologist, and she does work with dancers, and I remember talking about this particular role with her, and she gave me some really interesting things to work with, and I definitely applied most of those ideas and frameworks when I went back to addressing this role. It may be that I've labelled it as a psychological issue and kind of set something up there, if you like, kind of a trigger, a time-controlled trigger for myself somewhere. Could also be the case. But the reason I think it's psychological is because I do honestly feel that I've done everything in terms of the practice, the rehearsal. I feel like I have controlled all of those things, and these days, because I have a more aware approach psychologically, I feel like I've probably reached the limit of my knowledge as a performer with how to approach that psychologically. Perhaps further down the line in my studies as a psychologist, I might be able to explain it, or a similar scenario with somebody else. It will probably be too late for me to fix that particular role by that point. But I just can't see any other explanation having, really, really worked. I've got endless videos of me trying to nail some of those steps. And on virtually all of them, my wife is holding the camera and giving me really positive encouragement and constructive feedback, all of which is bang on. It's right on the head of the nail. What's that expression? Hit the nail on the head. And I can see that physically I'm on the right course to nail that step.
Yeah.
And there's also something about the regularity of it as well, that it's every time that I lost the ability to do this step, it was a week, give or take a day before we open the show. So I suspect there's some level of anxiety that's coming in and really interfering there. Yeah.
Are you willing and able to share some of the techniques that you worked on or used with this psychologist?
Yeah, some of that did revolve around anxiety. I think clearly the fact that I'd brought that particular role up in the conversation, and actually just a bit of context, at that point I had knee surgery, and I had gone into that surgery thinking that it was a meniscus repair and that I'd kind of be out of action for a couple of weeks and then get back to training. But of course, if you're going under the knife, I said to them, look, if there's anything else in there that needs clearing up, you may as well do it. So when I came out of surgery and I came round from the general anaesthetic, they said, oh yeah, it was a bit worse than we thought, and actually you're going to be out of action for between 9 and 18 months, which that was a shock. So it was as part of that rehab process that our clinical director, Dr. Nick Allen, said, well, look, why don't you talk to Britt? And I'm slightly deviating from the question here, but that again was a major spark for me in terms of psychology, because at that point I probably thought, as we know is common, that well I need to see a psychologist, I'm perfectly happy, and that was the start of me going, I can be doing great and be doing great work, and there's still this huge area of improvement. So Britt was great. And I'm not exactly sure how we came to that solo, because it seems that I probably would have been talking with her about motivation in rehab and mindsets and so on. So it must have been enough of an issue for me to bring it up and go, well, maybe I can use this time while I'm not performing to really to get some strategies. So when I do come back to performing, I can maybe address that one. And I think we spoke a little bit about maybe sort of pinpointing a specific aspect of that step as a sort of probably an attentional focus approach. So rather than letting all the anxiety come around, if we pick a particular aspect, moment in the execution of that sequence, it might not allow enough room for the anxiety to come around. And then, we spoke in a kind of longer term approach towards rehearsing the step and practicing the sequence and so on, about how I could get the most out of that process. And it's definitely worked for me in other things. Unfortunately, that one remains somehow isolated. So there's a kind of deeper seated issue with that particular step, I expect.
So what I hear you say there is the approach you both took was to improve your capacity to direct your attention in and around that move.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I've employed a lot since. I'm thinking of particularly in other things that are more at the technically challenging end of the things that I do. Where now it's really quite common for me to look at a particular solo or sequence and find what's the one or two things that I absolutely have to remember in this. So in the ideal world, I think a sort of kind of flow would take over in the performance. But what are the things that aren't going to be guaranteed? And to focus on those and go, I need to remember here to, let's say, plant my weight evenly on my right foot in the takeoff for that jump. Something really specific or I need to remember to get my heel down on the landing from this jump. Something very, very specific that I have to remember at a key point in the solo that almost feels like that piece of the jigsaw that if that's there, everything else will take care of itself. And I think that's probably an attentional focus or a distraction from some of the other stuff. And I think that might be, in terms of mechanics, that might be why that works for me. Yeah, but it seems to work.
This is an interesting line I wanted to talk to you about. So you've mentioned a particular attentional cue there. So how many, if you're going out to a performance, how many attention cues might you have? And can you give us other examples? And what I hear you say, therefore, that there is actually room for attentional cues. That I could be in the audience watching you, and there is a deliberate cognitive, so thought process going on. You're not just doing, you're thinking and doing some of the time.
Absolutely. And this is, of course, one of the areas that we differ from many sports, is that what we do is very set, very choreographed, and in theory should happen the same way every time we perform.
Yep.
In reality, of course, it doesn't. There's certain variables there. We will have rehearsed. We're a very busy company, so we give usually around about 150 shows a year, and within that there'll probably be something like 12 different evenings worth of ballet. So that's quite a lot of work, but even so, we would ideally have rehearsed a show for usually about 4 weeks going into the show. So during that process, I'll find, hopefully these days, where I need to put those cues in. So sometimes it might be a particular entrance or something where I go, oh yeah, I need to remember to do that because for whatever reason it's not programmed in to the same extent as other things, or I need to remember that particular prop. So it could be, literally remembering the choreography correctly, but other times it is a really technical thing, and it will be absolutely a physical cue in terms of I need to remember to count this part of the music so that I do that takeoff on exactly that part of the beat, and at that point I need to. Now this is interesting because it could be a really useful instruction in terms of the execution of the particular movement. So a technical cue about I need to pull my arm inwards at that particular moment of the turn. Whereas other times it could be more imagery based. So and in which case it would be a self-talk cue for me to say eyes up, or whatever the particular useful self-talk cue is at that point. But because we perform to music, and the choreography, again, in theory, should always be synced with the music, very often the music can take care of that for me. And I think it's something that me as an individual, I'm very music driven, so I associate those cues with a particular section of music. And as long as I've kind of programmed that in during the rehearsal process, in many occasions the self-talk almost isn't necessary because the music does that, if that makes sense. So there's a particular phrase in the music where I go, not even really consciously, hopefully by that point, where I go, oh, this is where I need to straighten my leg, and it happens. In an ideal world, that happens.
Would you say the music is an external cue or an internal cue?
That's a fascinating question because for me and my feeling, I've done a lot of thinking over this out. Why I dance, why do I love this, why is dance so important to people and to audiences, why is it so powerful as an art form, why is it something that is universal? We're talking everybody in the world dances, right? Everybody does, some of us professionally and
some of us very badly.
Well, there's no bad dance then.
Wow, that sounds like a conversation to have
There's
in
no
and of
bad dance.
itself.
You might be surprised at the dance that I do in my kitchen, for example, in contract I'm paid to do. Um, so the question of whether music is an internal or an external cue is fascinating. There's a lot of great research. When I'm off duty as a dancer and I'm off duty as a psych student, I tend to combine the two and read about music psychology.
Yep.
And really, a lot of the time, what we're doing as dancers is trying to internalize the music so that we can then express that outwardly in a different way again. So I think it's certainly a bit of both. And because for us as a company, we're really lucky that we almost always dance to live music. We have our own orchestra. The argument for it being an external cue might center around the fact that because that music is live, it's of course different every time to some extent. So we're responding and working in tandem with that music. So during the rehearsal process, you've probably internalized that relationship of the movement and the music. In the same way, it's kind of a skill acquisition process where maybe, I'm a football fan, so that's my main reference for sport. You know that if somebody's played a particular long looping ball due across the field, you're ideally going to receive that in a certain way. You're not necessarily thinking about how you're going to receive it. So for us, when the music takes a certain tempo, we're not ideally going to sit there and go, oh, the music's quick today, how am I going to deal with this? We've already internalized those natural variations in tempo during the rehearsal process. In that sense, it's an external cue that we will have internalized, if that makes sense.
It makes 100% sense. And let's use our football analogy here. No, the footballer, soccer player, is not going to think about how he or she controls the ball, but they are going to be consciously aware of what's going on around them. And that is a conscious process. So it seems to me, if we were trying to work here on paralleling with dancing, that I might not be consciously aware of most of the movements I'm making. I don't have to self-monitor. I don't have to consciously put my foot here or put my foot there or do whatever with my torso. But I am aware of the music externally, and that's driving my rhythm, what I do next. So I'm relating the movement to the external, the music, but at the same time I might also have an internal appreciation of that. And there's some form of self-monitoring going on at the same time for you to be able to adjust at any given time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just thinking about how that plays out in our performances. So given that our performances are choreographed, there's almost no improvisation in ballet. It very, very rarely happens unless something's gone wrong, which also happens quite a lot, by the way. There are the variations and the things where we do need to be self-aware are around things like perhaps something has gone wrong on stage, a particular prop hasn't worked, or a costume's broken and somebody's kind of broken down in the choreography because of that, or some worst case scenario, perhaps somebody's got injured and you're having to think on your feet there. There's also things like we're a touring company, so there's actually quite a lot of variation in the size of the stage from one venue to the next. Those kinds of things where it does happen, for example, where some stages are quite loud just in the way that they're physically constructed, and that if I land particularly heavy on this portion of the stage, it's going to sound really loud. And one of the ideals for us is that people don't hear you land. It's part of the kind of magic of dance, is the illusion, right? Okay. So those kinds of things are maybe the things that you would be thinking about. One of the things that's on my reading list here is a book all about flow, and I'm interested in that as a concept because for me there seems to be, and if I'm understanding the idea of flow correctly, there seems to be an ideal performance state where you're not thinking about anything you don't need to be thinking about, and I think that the flow would ideally, in my context here, put me in a position where everything is taken care of itself, and then if those difficult things that I do need to respond to occur, I've got almost all of my mental bandwidth there ready to deal with those things. That would be the ideal, and the reality is that there's never been a show where there hasn't been something that you have to deal with. And usually it's not a major issue, but there is always something.
Okay, several things to say, and I'm going to introduce an interesting person into the mix, and I'm pleased we've gone down this path. I would, without necessarily having any scientific rationale for what I'm about to say, just cover that basis so I don't get shouted at. I would disseminate between maybe a high performance mindset and flow. I just wonder, and I know I'm opening up myself here, I just wonder if there's a difference between the two, and I love the work of, say, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi on flow. Everybody does. I think it's brilliant work, and obviously there's various things that helps people get into this flow. I think I've always felt that this notion of I practice and I prepare to compete or to perform in flow is an unrealistic one. I've always felt, and I suppose it's reflected in my own practice, that I'd rather have this notion of I practice and prepare to compete or perform in a high performance mindset, whatever that looks like for different people. If flow happens, brilliant. And I think your definition of flow within your context is a really, really good one, is a really useful one, that it will just happen and the bandwidth is there to deal with the things that are thrown at you, internally and externally. But things are thrown at you internally and externally. I think that's the reason of it, and maybe flow is I just deal with it, bang, I can just deal with it on the day. On other days, I wonder if it's just tougher, and you've got to be able to, you've got to have that capacity. And I think that that's where mental skills and the kind of things you've spoken about, imagery, self-talk, counting, so that feels to me like the cadence of the performance, those kind of things, that's where they're really important.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I think the mindset thing, I'm going to read about this later on before I get back into the next module of my studies while I've still got reading time to pursue these things. But I was just thinking maybe that flow is like those kind of flying dreams where you're just floating through a performance. And so maybe that is a mindset issue where all these things that are trying to distract or disrupt your performance, maybe it's just part of the mindset thing that you're either not letting them, or you're not letting them disrupt your performance, that is, but you're also sort of just not bothered at the same time in the best possible way, that you're very accepting that, okay, so in my context, that particular jump wasn't perfect. But you know what? The performance is still good. I still completed that step in a more than adequate fashion. It hasn't affected what the audience is receiving from this performance. So maybe flow is something to do with bigger picture rather than getting hung up on the intricacies that in our world, the overwhelming majority of the audience wouldn't pick up on. You know, it would only be the really, really technically minded ballet specialists in the audience, maybe, that might be critical of those things.
When you say not bothered, that really resonates with me, and I think is certainly a strong part of my work, and I'm going to take that in the direction, again, I might take this in a different direction, I'm going to take that in the direction of achievement goal theory. So having an ego versus a task orientation. And I'm slightly taking liberties here, because you can have a task or a mastery focus or orientation. I want to accomplish this task, and that still means you're bothered. So I'm slightly taking liberties. But if you add, what research has suggested is that a task or a mastery orientation, so I'm going out in this performance to achieve tasks rather than being too ego oriented, so to impress or to achieve a certain outcome against somebody else, or to be the best dancer on the stage, that can get in the way. That can drive, that can motivate, that can help, absolutely, and research has suggested that. It's not binary. But a lot of research suggests that being task or mastery oriented, and I think if you potentially cover that task and mastery orientation with a narrative around what you can and can't control, and just look, hey, I can't control what other people think of me, I can't control how other dancers dance, I can't completely, and here's I think the interesting notion, I can't completely control my performance, but what I can do is strive to move in this way. Strive to use my self-talk when I need to. Strive to use these cues. Strive to listen to the music. Pay attention to the music and respond accordingly. Keep my cadence or my rhythm or whatever it is. I can do these things. So my narrative, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, going into a Saturday performance, let's say, that's where my narrative is going to be. So it's in part a rational narrative in line with goal achievement theory, in my opinion. That's kind of what I'm hearing by a not bothered statement, and I completely agree. And this is the real paradox of performance, and what a lot of people don't necessarily realise is that actually a lot of the time you might be better off going into an event in a not bothered state of mind rather than an overly bothered state of mind, because it frees you up.
Yes, there's a lot there. And I think one of the things that's different for us from sport, I've been thinking a lot about this recently. There's something, I don't know when people will necessarily listen to this episode. Of course, we're talking now at the point where lockdown is being lifted in the UK. As dancers, we haven't performed since March. So what we've had is this period of reflection where we are looking at a bigger picture and what matters to us in our work. And one of the things that I've been thinking about there is, why do we do this? One of the differences for us in sport is that if you go to sport, now I'm an Aston Villa fan, if I go to Villa Park to watch a game, I'm going there because I want to see if Villa can be better than the opposition.
Yep.
Now clearly at this point in time, that's rare. But in sport, generally, you're going to see if somebody can do that thing better than other people can do it, whatever that is. I think when people come to watch a Birmingham Royal Ballet performance, they're not coming to see you compete. They're coming to see you be excellent. They assume that you can do that thing. That's what they paid their money for. So they're not coming to see you attempt to solo. They're coming to see you absolutely perfect that solo. That's my appraisal, if you like, of the situation there. Now that translates into a certain type of pressure where we are aiming for perfection. But then to delve a little deeper into that, whose idea of perfection? Because what we do, the idea of what's good, what's not good, is entirely subjective. So you have one person who is turning 15 turns in a pirouette, which is technically incredible, but does it speak to a member of the audience artistically? more than somebody that's turning 5 turns in a pirouette in the same solo, in the same routine, the same dance. That is where it becomes interesting for us, because the bigger picture for us in terms of what is the goal here, the goal in any particular show is to move the audience emotionally, to inspire, to excite, all of those things. Now, we put pressure on ourselves technically to do those 15 turns. But the reality is also that that doesn't matter to the audience. So the picture for us, or to large sections of the audience, that doesn't matter. And that's not to say that we shouldn't aspire to that and we shouldn't pursue that technical expertise, day in and day out, because we should. That's what drives us forward. But in terms of when you're out there and you're performing and your elite performance mindset, are we going to let what we might put as shortcomings, technical shortcomings, disrupt and interfere with our performance when that isn't really the goal? So above a basic technical standard, a minimal technical standard, which we have as professionals, our goal is really something different. Our goal is to tell a story in this particular way, or to create a particular atmosphere. Sometimes it is really to impress with a really impressive lift sequence, a duet, something like that. But it's not about achieving necessarily a certain physical level in the way that many sports are, where you're measuring or you're counting distance or time. It is so much more subjective than that. So one of the things that's been interesting for us during lockdown, I think, and speaking to some of my colleagues and peers around the dance world, is that these are the kind of reflections I'm hearing from a lot of dancers, that we're going, let's just step away, because we haven't been training in groups like this. And you're going, there's been this whole process for us going, do I need to do a ballet class today? I'm not rehearsing. What am I doing a ballet class for? This is about maintaining a basic standard over time. And you're thinking, but maybe I can do something else that steps away from the technical side of it that is also going to aid my performance. For me, that's studying, because I know that that's going to aid my performance. But in terms of this, in terms of goal theory, the main thing that we have to do is really understand exactly what our goal is. And I think that this period of reflection has been really good for that.
In many respects, I've always found the art of sports psychology is listening to the narrative and then helping someone create an adaptive narrative, a flexible narrative. That can be a forerunner to mental skills, which is a forerunner to high performing more consistently under pressure. And what I hear you say, listening to you there, you said, what is our goal? It sounds to me, and obviously this is coming from my world here, listening to what you're saying, in a sentence, is to execute perfect movement to emotionally move the audience. And so there's two strands there. There's execution of perfect movement, which can cause anxiety in and of itself. And then, because we're looking at enormously high conscientiousness there, I have to practice all day, every day, to make sure that my movement is perfect. It must be perfect. It must be perfect. It must have tos. It has to be perfect. So we're going into rational emotive stuff there. And then the second strand is to emotionally move the audience. And wow, that's an exacerbation of pressure, because if I've got 400 people in the audience, you've got 400 people who might be moved differently. So I've got two strands there, perfect movement and emotionally move the audience, that are enormously pressure inducing in many respects. and I could imagine can lead to, yes, an overwhelm of anxiety. Yes, a perfectionist mentality that could lead to burnout, injury. What I heard you say within that narrative is that, studying to me is one way I deal with it, because I get away from dancing, and that is very much an identity thing. Absolutely 101 in sports psychology, helping sports people have multiple identities to lessen anxiety around their sport and for well-being, obviously.
I'd like to pick up on that unidimensional identity thing, actually, if that's okay. The world that we live in, and I'll speak specifically about classical ballet companies of a similar size and who do a similar number of performances and touring schedule to us. For a little bit of context there, we are on tour usually anything from 20 to 25 weeks of the year. And during that time, we're in small dressing rooms, on tour buses, usually perform twice a day. When we're not performing, we're rehearsing. We work 6 days a week. It's an all-consuming job, and the risk there of developing this kind of unidimensional identity is very much there. So it's something that if I were a qualified psychologist, I might be better placed to identify those indicators in certain individuals. I suspect, and of course I wouldn't name individuals, but I've seen cases over the years where I think that unidimensional identity has led to burnout, and certainly in some cases, if that were burnout, that has then also led to dropout and leaving the profession. One of the ways that I think that I have necessarily deliberately or consciously mitigated that risk has been studying. Our schedule is quite punishing, but it's also at times quite regular. So, and this is where your podcast came in, actually, Dan, that I remember really clearly the first time I listened to your podcast. It was the Damien Hughes episode talking about the Barcelona way, which I've read several times since, actually, and it's coming back around again on my reading list. And it meant that I could finish a show, I could get on the tour bus, because it's all rock and roll on the tour bus, right? I'd get on the tour bus with a Tesco meal deal and some sports psych on the podcast, and it meant that I could be doing something constructive during that time, learning, educating myself, but crucially getting far enough away from dance that there was this whole other strand. And one of the things that I liked initially about sports psych, and I still do, is that it pulls together lots of areas of my life. So I'm a football fan. I watch as much football as I can. I love music. I'm a live music fan. And the things that holds all these things together is this live performance idea, and that there's this series of commonalities that run between all of those areas. And who knows, one of the things that actually is in that Barcelona Way book, I can't remember the name of the researchers, but he talks about these big, hairy, audacious goals, right? And that's something that I've been looking at, in this kind of 10-year plan.
I think is it Jim Collins, Good to Great? The book Good to Great by Jim Collins, who talks about big, hairy, audacious goals. It's actually a business book, but it's a BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal.
That's it, and they do. They talk about it in the context of business, but on an individual level, that's been really interesting. And so putting my own kind of 10 to 30 year plan in place and what that might mean, and looking at all these areas of interest where the performance psychology is present in all of them. That's informed my BHAG, if you like, And if you have me back on in 10 to 30 years, we can assess how they're working out
went,
for me.
yeah.
But yeah, so the something that again, I'm not, as we know, a qualified psychologist, but I think it is within my remit as a good colleague, if you like, to really help some of my colleagues where I think there perhaps is a potential risk of this unidimensional identity, to really encourage these hobbies and also demonstrate that we can have other stuff going on in our life. You know, it's not uncommon for dancers in this company, and certainly in other companies, that their partners are also dancers. My wife is a dancer in the same company with us. For us, that works really, really well, because we travel together. When I go on tour, she's there as well, and our lives don't stop. You know, that side of our life is not on hold in that time. But it does mean that you can end up with this really limited experience. So, and I was listening, forgive me because I can't remember the name of the person you were talking to, but actually yesterday I was listening to an episode, and this unidimensional identity came up. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that because elite performance requires passion and determination and dedication and diligence, that it is so easy for that to creep into all areas of your life and for it to be a dominant feature. You know, people are surprised when they see me with a beer sometimes. I'm going, well, yeah, there's a time and a place for it, but I can't go out drinking, or, you know, if I have shows the next day or whatever, there's a time and a place for it. But it's interesting to me that the thought is always there. You know, some of my 19-year-old colleagues might go at the end of the day, oh, should we go for a beer? And I'll go, no, I've got 2 shows tomorrow, I can't do it, but if you guys can, go ahead. You know, that kind of thing. So the awareness is always there. But equally, the other side of that is there are people who are perhaps not aware that the awareness is there, if you see what I mean, and the negative side of that. So they will immediately run home from the theatre and go, no, I'm going straight home and I'm going to do another round of Pilates, and then I'm going to eat a really specific meal that's made up to maximise my potential tomorrow, and then I'm going to sleep exactly 8.25 hours. And, you know, it becomes this completely dominant feature in life. And then, of course, it's over at a certain point.
Yeah.
And then what? You know, as with all physical disciplines, the physical decline is inescapable at a certain point. So, you know, and then what afterwards, when this dominant thing in your life isn't there, and it's all you've invested in over the years, then what?
Well, there's so much rich stuff there, and trying to kind of recap on some of the stuff you've said, and also bring it back to, you know, executing that perfect movement and dealing with the emotion of the audience. I love what you said there. I mean, in psychology, we talk about athletic identity, and as I said earlier, and as you're saying, helping athletes, people, performers, establish multiple identities in order to deal with the anxiety of performance. And athletes and performers are so scared to do that, as you're saying at the end there. They're very philosophically, over the last 40, 50 years, as sport has become more serious in society, and we use like grind, perfect, and we hear tales of, I don't know, basketball players getting up at 3 a.m. to go practice and stuff like that, and which they probably only did once or twice in their life, but then everybody just perceives that, kids perceive that they've got to do it every day. We need to be very careful with these messages, because my belief is that actually, in many respects, our job as coaches, as psychologists, as support staff, is to actually help an individual explore becoming the very best that they can be without damaging well-being, and finding a process that does explore helping them be the very best that they can be. Because it might be that certain individuals actually their performance actually diminishes as a consequence of these so marginal gains. I've got to explore the 1%. I've got to explore the marginal gains, and it's not everybody in life is set up to be like that. And then we're talking right now, and everybody is into. I don't know if you've watched any episodes, The Last Dance on Netflix, which is the basketball, and how Bill Jackson in the 90s, the Chicago Bulls treated Dennis Rodman, brilliantly in terms of recognised there's somebody who is probably far more extroverted than others, probably quite low conscientious, and needed to get away from the routine every single day and just go mad in Vegas, which he did. Came back and was awesome. So I'm hearing from the world of dancing the importance of multiple identities, and that helps with well-being. It helps with potentially your future life, as you say, post-career. But coming back also to performance, it can aid performance because you're not spending every single day immersed in this anxiety of I've got to perform, got to be perfect, got to emotionally move the audience. And I think that's where there's a neat link there, and also, and I'll get your comment on this, where I was going before we talked multiple identities, which I think is vital. And I need to do an episode on it, is having that narrative that's actually much more towards and you've got to have a negotiation with yourself. If you're somebody who wants to be outstanding, to me, I'd be really interested in your thoughts here. You've got to have the capacity to negotiate with yourself, to say, I'm working hard every single day, I'm doing these steps, I would like to have a 10 out of 10 performance. What does that look like? What does that feel like? Okay, I know what that looks like, but I also have to accept that might not happen. I'd like to influence everybody in the audience emotionally, but I accept that won't happen. You have to be able to flex between the two narratives, in my opinion, and that's your sweet spot. And to me, when you find that sweet spot of I'd like to, I don't have to, but I'd like to, and I accept it might not happen, then that invites in a high performance mindset, and it may even invite in this notion of flow. Does that resonate with you at all?
It does, absolutely, and it's this idea of self-compassion that goes hand in hand with this kind of self-awareness. So you can talk about pragmatism, and this idea of controlling the controllables and acceptance that maybe your high performance is driven by this desire, this kind of perfectionism, but having the self-awareness and ideally also the guidance from coaches, sports psych, whoever, to just be aware that when those behaviours do become maladaptive, and that kind of self-compassion to go, you know what, that's okay. Not the maladaptive part, but it's okay that I'm not achieving that particular element on this occasion. And having this this kind of holistic look at everything that you're doing and going, well, I'm here, I'm doing the thing that I want to do, and this is really broad stroke stuff, but going, I'm here, I you've achieved whatever level you've achieved, and you've improved over time because in some way you're getting enough out of it that the journey and the process is important enough. And you mentioned there about Jordan and this idea that he was just, there's this perception now in hindsight that he was just awesome all of the time and never missed a play and was just on his top game, and of course it's just not true. But he was on top of his game enough and made enough successful passes and scored enough points over time to be remembered for his career in the way that he is, and held up to that kind of high standard. But it's important to recognise in people like that these greats of any discipline weren't great all the time. And Jordan talks about, he missed crucial points on shots, match winning or tournament winning shots. So I mean, as an England football fan, you can look at people that have missed penalties, for example, over the years, and maybe it's something that's part of the English psyche. I don't know, but some of these. I mean, for example, David Beckham. I think he's recovered quite well, but the guy was vilified horrendously for certain things in football, and there's no doubt that player was incredible, and his approach and I don't know if anyone's really got into his kind of psych ideas, but clearly the application and his work rate was incredible, and he must at some point have enjoyed that. There can't have been too many maladaptive behaviours, and perhaps for all the application and dedication and diligence. I mean, we mentioned earlier about people staying back after training to practice certain elements of their game. Clearly Beckham is an often cited example of that. But he must also have had enough else going on in his life that he's now got this subsequent career. And you could argue, well, it's easy when you're that successful and that famous. But I think what I'm getting at is that there's enough time in life for both. There really is, And my wife actually did her master's dissertation on perfectionism and maladaptive elements there. So that's been a long-running, really interesting conversation in our household. She's one of our top performers, and she's undoubtedly a perfectionist. And it's a really interesting one because for her, dancing and the technical challenges and so on are there 24/7. I frequently walk into the living room and she's looking really serious and completely in her own world at 11 o'clock at night thinking about a role. And there's the amount of times I've thought that I'm in trouble because she goes, "Kit, I need to ask you a question." And I'm thinking, oh my word, what have I done? And then she'll ask me a really specific technical question about the way that she should do a certain role, But I wouldn't say in any way that, despite being really at the top of her game and all bias aside, really top, excellent performer, she's got a balance quite well. It's interesting for me to look at that balance because, if anything, I'm perhaps the other side. Sometimes I feel I don't think enough about dance, and I go in and I work really hard when I'm there, but maybe I should stay back and practice. But in the meantime, I'm out studying because I'm going, I'm going to come at this from a psych perspective. And I don't know, maybe the reverse or the logical extension of that is also that you can have so many things going on that actually maybe you're not applying yourself to the optimal potential in your main discipline, if you like. I think I've got slightly off topic there.
No, I don't think you haven't. And just, it's really interesting what you're saying about your wife there. It makes me think of, personality characteristics, and they're not binary. Our personality characteristics, as she sounds like somebody who's very high conscientious, is high achievement striving, and if we're high in achievement striving, then again it's recognizing the strengths of that and the limitations of that, and striving to find a balance. And there's definitely some people who garner a lot of energy from being like that because, again, that's who they are, whether they're born that way or whether they've been that way or whether it's an interaction between the two and realised over time. And I think it's recognising it might be that 80% of that is like, yeah, right, and I can think about dancing all day long, and that energises me, and that makes me feel great, and that helps me be ready, and I'm never going to burn out as a consequence of that. But it is also looking at that maybe few percent where it does hinder. I start to, think about it so much that it might not burn me out, but I start to question my performance. And I'm sure there's countless other examples that I can't think of right now. So personality characteristics are an interesting phenomenon because they're neither good nor bad. They help and hinder. both at the same time, and it's having that for me, it's having that capacity to negotiate with yourself, to be able to deal with those things. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And that's the characteristics thing. It's something. Again, there's an area there that was part of what attracted me to performance side of psychology, or the psychology of performance, if you like. And part of that is a personality factors, because I had observed over time that people had these different approaches to really pressurized situations, pressurized roles, performances on stage, particularly in terms of sort of pre-performance routines. And I was seeing different body languages from different performers approaching the same roles. So some people, for example, we get a kind of 5-minute call and a beginner's call. People are gathering on stage, and some people are, doing a physical warm-up still at that point. Some people are going through the choreography. And some people noticed that some people were really in a deep focus there, where you just thought they're not even going to notice anybody else around them. They're completely in that zone. And then other people would be just larking around and really outwardly completely relaxed. And not that they were necessarily unfocused in any way, but that seemed to be their approach. Since I've studied, zone of optimal functioning, these kinds of things, and equally, the catastrophe theory and these kind of things, and just it's been really interesting for me in my studies to kind of, with hindsight, look back and go, oh, I wonder if that's what happened on that occasion, either to me or somebody else. And what's really interesting is that I think these are skills that you develop over time. Some of them you observe certain behaviours in people who are in some way role models, perhaps, and sometimes you just learn what works for you and what doesn't. For example, I used to always, when I had something that I had identified as a major role or something that I felt pressure, I'd have a playlist. And over time, I realised that the kind of activation that I got from that playlist wasn't always putting me in that optimal zone. I'd have gone past it, and I was kind of I was feeling more anxious, and this pre-performance anxiety was becoming a hazard, and it was becoming an obstacle. So I realised, okay, maybe that's not the approach for me, and that's probably the point where I started actively observing other people's pre-performance approaches. And what I noticed is that it doesn't always work, right? So and I know that sounds obvious, but and again, without naming individuals, see, there are occasions where people experience that kind of anxiety, and there is no clear, obvious trigger. And on the occasions where it's perhaps a good friend, and I'm able to have an honest discussion about that. And here's another thing, that because people are aware that I'm studying psychology, people are quite forthcoming with things. And obviously, because I'm a good student, I know the limitations of my knowledge. So I'm always careful to say to these people, I cannot say that I'm going to be able to provide you with anything that's going to help. But if you want to talk to me about it, it will help me, right? So, and I have some great colleagues that are very forthcoming with that. But what I have seen is people who perhaps have performed a particular role countless times before, in really big venues or really small venues, or in high pressure situations, perhaps in less pressure situations, but then something in a really innocuous context, a really innocuous occasion, will really struggle with anxiety. And often they can't identify what the difference was themselves. And I thought, well, that's fascinating, because particularly if that person has a not too rigorous or fixed pre-performance routine, but they're very experienced, they know what works for them, they know what their optimum zone is, something disrupts that and they can't identify it, that for me is really, really interesting. Now, of course, it's horrible when you see that to a really extreme level where that person is really, really suffering. Of course, and I'd be in a position eventually to be able to provide an intervention at that moment. But of course, I think the ideal would be that people have been equipped with these things long in advance to prevent it. It's exactly the same as injury prevention, right? That we prevention is better than cure. So certainly part of my education, or rather not part of my education, we didn't get any psychological skills training. Nothing. And certainly nothing that was clearly taught, this is psychology, this is performance, this is going to make you a better performer, this is going to help you to deal with situations that may arise that could potentially disrupt your performance, or any, mental toughness I know is debated as a kind of terminology, but the idea, however we phrase it, we weren't given any training in that. I think things are different now. I think there's probably still a huge way to go, and perhaps an aspiration for me, if I were to do some work in dance further down the line as a hopefully qualified psych, might be to apply some of those things at that kind of academy level, to give people these things and help people then make their own choices. Are they going to be that professional that's larking around 10 seconds before the curtain goes up on the show, or before they start the players tunnel, or are they the people that are there with their headphones on getting their zone? Just give people the ability to work these things out, and also then to have these techniques and strategies when the things that you can't mitigate for occur.
It's very individual, isn't it? I mean, I love what you've just said over the last few minutes there. It's really insightful, and it is. As you were speaking, I was thinking about the challenges from sports people with regard to anxiety and the lack of consistency there. I agree with you. I just think sometimes anxiety can come out of nowhere and disrupt. Whether one has or doesn't have a pre-performance routine, and I think I agree. I think prevention rather than cure. I think that in an ideal world, in all performance domains, there's access to somebody or some process whereby performers can develop what I would call a mental skills framework, which would involve that, say, performance or pre-performance routine. And I think when that's in place, then it's possible to have maybe deeper, more philosophical conversations with performers, where they might seek out sports psych if they've got mental skills process in place, mental skills framework in place, but they're occasionally having these experiences of anxiety. They're just popping up out of nowhere, and you can build a skills framework that's in place, but that is ideally in place in the first place, if nothing else, just for a performer to be able to offload, just talk and just say, hey, this happened, and just that process of talking can help. I think it's absolutely fascinating. I think what I'd like to do, I'd like to finish on, because I'm mindful of your time. We've been going quite some time. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant stuff. It's really, really interesting, and it's I'm keen to say to the audience that this is everything that you're talking about, Kit, is exactly the same in sport. There's subtle nuances, obviously, but it really is the same. I'm going to read an excerpt from a book. We're going to come back to the flow, but we'll close this conversation in a few minutes. I'd just like to get your brief comment on this. I actually mentioned this name on the sports site a few weeks ago, Barbara Gale Montero, and her book Thought in Action, and we're going to come back to the idea of flow and high performance mindset and stuff, and this idea of don't think. She's written this book. It's a brilliant book. I'll get her on the Sports Psych show someday. And she's written this book. She's formerly a dancer. She's now I think at New York University, and she's a philosopher. And she's written this very philosophical book, regaling against the idea of just do it, the principle of just do it. And actually, she's created this term, cognition in action. So essentially thinking in action. And she says her working hypothesis is this. For experts, so let's think about all performance domains. For experts, when all is going well, optimal or near optimal performance frequently employs some of the following conscious mental processes: self-reflective thinking, planning, predicting, deliberation, attention to or monitoring of their actions, conceptualizing their actions, control, trying, effort, having a sense of the self, and acting for a reason. Moreover, such mental processes do not necessarily or even generally interfere with expert performance and should not generally be avoided by experts. And and this is where I say I completely agree with it. And my experience is this notion of when I've experienced sports competitors say to me, oh, well, coach just wants me to blank my mind and just play. It underestimates the internal mechanisms that can distract us, the emotions, attentional processes, etc. It underestimates the complexity of performance. So in a perspective, what the opposition is doing, from your perspective as a dancer, what the crowd is thinking. And so all of those things, predicting, deliberating, planning, attention to and monitoring actions, what she's saying is expect that as an expert. That's not a bad thing. Expect it. Perhaps you have to manage it, but that isn't anti-flow, it's part of flow. And that last bit I've kind of I think that's what she would say, but yeah. So, it's your thoughts on that?
Well, I've made a note to read that.
Yeah.
Albert Montero, I've got that here. I'll be on the online looking for that later. Yeah, it's a really interesting thing, and I'd love to. I wish I'd read that before we had this conversation. But it's this idea of paralysis by analysis as well, which we know, and I think everyone that certainly the way that manifests for me, and I know for some of my colleagues and peers in dance, we've rehearsed a routine, we know the steps, we know exactly how it should pan out, you know the choreography. There's that idea of muscle memory. We know we can do it, we've probably done it 100 times before we get to perform it. And then suddenly midway through a performance you think, what's the next step? And that's when you go wrong. So we know that the paralysis by analysis is there. So I'd be interested to read her work around how those thought patterns maybe occur. Sort of, are there potential sequences where that paralysis by analysis effect happens on a certain pathway, a certain ordering of those thoughts?
I mean, can I just interject? My interpretation, and as I said, I'd love to have a conversation. I haven't had a conversation with her yet, and I don't want to put words into her mouth. But let me give you my interpretation: is that all she's doing is what I would do, which is rebel against the idea. And in essence, you've outlined this for the past hour and a half or so. Is that it's not just a case of we go and practice and we just go and do it. It's a case, I heard you talk about having attentional cues, using self-talk, counting, attending to the music, how attending to the music has an inner meaning to you. So please don't get me wrong. I think that paragraph I've read out relates exactly to what you're saying. I don't think it contradicts at all. I'm sure she would say there is anxiety in performance and there is overthinking in performance. What she's saying is, I think, a description and a solution orientation here. What she's saying is high performance doesn't delete all of those things. They can involve all of those things. They can be done excessively. You don't want to do those things excessively. And a solution to performance challenge lies in having attentional cues, using self-talk, etc. Whereas the just do it principle doesn't even involve, those kind of mental skills. Essentially, it's just, high performance is just go and do it. So I think that's.
It is really what she's getting at, that, you can just do it, but you won't do it your best. Is that maybe the thing? It's not going to achieve potential unless you have this cognitive involvement.
Which is what you've outlined for an hour or so by saying that I have cognition. We have cognition. We're on the stage. We're thinking about certain things at certain times. It's not that there's no thought. There's some thought. There's bits of thought rather than 5,000 bits of thought. When I have 5,000 bits of thought, that's when I can get myself into trouble. If I have a bit of thought here, if I have some attentional cues, if I have my self-talk there ready for me, that's the idea of mental skills, is that I'm ready to go out there. Now, I'm not going to use them excessively, but they're tools ready for me to use. And as you said yourself, if I watch you dance, Kit, and I watch you within your company, I watch a performance, I'm going to sit there and I'm just watching you guys, and I'm going, wow, this is incredible. You internally are dealing with all the challenges. You might have your a fellow dancer making a mistake, and that might make a difference to how you feel in that moment and react and respond. You're dealing with all kinds of things. I'm just looking at that going, I could even sit there and say, you've blanked your mind and you're just doing that, and this is all automatic. Automaticity, yes, that is involved in performance, but come on, it's like driving a car. We drive a car with our hand on the gear stick and our feet on the pedals, and we're looking at the road ahead. Now, my ability to change gears and brake and stuff, that's very automatic now, but it's based on what I'm seeing. But what I'm seeing, I've got to attend to the road. I've got to look at the hazards. I've got to look at things that are encroaching on me. I also have to attend to where I'm going. And so there's an element of automaticity within our performance, no doubts about that, and we don't want to get too involved with that. But there's also an element of conscious awareness, of an internal conscious awareness and an external conscious awareness. And really the sweet spot is that internal and external conscious awareness not being, the volume being turned up too loud, but it can't be at zero, because if it's at zero, then I don't think we'll high perform.
I completely agree, and I think that transfers between disciplines. If you're in a group sport or in a choreo group like me, or whether you're doing something where, there surely isn't anything in the world where there's absolutely zero external distraction potential. So, I'm thinking of a solo sport, maybe, a long jumper or something that, there's any number of things that, although that person is competing sort of on their own in isolation, that, of course there are things happening. So maybe that goes back to flow. So it's this balance, right, between, so for us, we'd have rehearsed the choreography, and either whether people necessarily are aware of it or not, they are also rehearsing the cognitive side of it. So some of those dancers may be aware that they're rehearsing attentional cues at the same time, and they may be more conscious of the cognitive mechanisms that underpin the physical processes that they're doing, and how they operate in tandem. It's this theory, this limited capacity thing, right? That we want to have rehearsed and controlled all the things that are controllable, so that they don't need the attention, so that they do sort of take care of themselves, so that we can then open up the attentional capacity for the thing we haven't been able to control. So in my world, that would be, perhaps a more slippery performance surface than usual, or a costume malfunction, or, there's a different dancer in the cast than usual that you never noticed did this section differently, and then you realise at that moment, oh, okay, they're doing this grip differently, or any of those things. That the rehearsal process, I suppose, enables us to have freed up enough of our attention to be able to deal with these things. So Yeah, I fully agree with Barbara Gale Montero there, and I look forward to reading that, because that sounds really interesting. As I'm already aware at this reasonably early stage in my psych journey, we love it when a theory is challenged. we love it. So already in the early stages of that, I was jumping on something, say self-determination theory, and really just applying that to all areas of stuff that I'm doing. And then further on down the line, having people challenge elements of that, or really particular ways that challenge my understanding of it. And I love that. And that's why people like me could talk with people like you all day on this stuff.
Vice versa as well. That's been a really, really interesting. I was completely immersed in the conversation there, Kit. So look, thank you so much. I don't know if you do. I assume you do social media. I don't know if you want to be found. Just if you want to be contacted, how can people get in touch, or how can people find tickets for your future performances?
I do social media. I've done a little bit of studying social media, so my approach to it has changed over the years. I do use Twitter. I'm reachable on Twitter at Kit Holder. I tend not to be particularly active on Twitter. I find it's where there's a lot of venom and bile in the world generally seems to find its way to Twitter. But I do, a lot of my sports psych browsing happens through Twitter actually. But I do respond to it if people do want to get in touch that way. So if you do, I will see it. I do have Instagram if you're particularly interested in looking at pictures of me dancing and wearing makeup, or there's some great pictures at the moment of me in a dress, so that may amuse you. But if it's more serious psych questions, Twitter may be the better approach. As a company, we have a website that's Birmingham Royal Ballet. You'll find us on Google. It's www.brb.org.uk. I do have a personal website, but I'm about to take it offline because it's massively out of date.
Fair enough. Well, look, Kit, I can only but thank you for giving up your time. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on Barbara's book, and maybe we'll get you back on in the future and we'll discuss it. So thanks so much, Kit.
Several years down the line, when I'm a qualified psych and I can talk with true qualified knowledge.
No, not at all. I think you brought so much interesting and really, I suppose, a unique insight and interesting information to the table over the last hour and a half. So thank you, mate.
Thanks for having me on.
No worries. Wow, that was awesome. I really, really enjoyed that podcast. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.